Morning, everybody. There are lots of famous Supreme Court cases explaining what the government does or what it can do, and it was on this date in 1819, on March 6, that McCulloch v. Maryland was decided, which expanded the power of the federal government. When our Constitution was set up with the separation of powers, no one was really sure how that was going to work. But we tried it, didn't we? And one of the questions was who gets to decide if something's constitutional. And in 1803, in Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court took upon itself that role of what we call judicial review, if something's constitutional or not. And that's where we are today. So in Washington's original cabinet, we have Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. And Hamilton had a very robust view of the role of the federal government, and he was especially fascinated by the Bank of England and the role that that bank had in the rise of the British Empire. So he advocated for a strong, centralized national bank. His big rival in so many areas was Thomas Jefferson, who didn't want that. He was real nervous about anything that consolidated power away from the states. So there was a real back and forth in the cabinet and in the country, but finally Washington signed legislation which created the first bank of the United States in Philadelphia. But it was not authorized by Congress in 1811, so it faded from the scene. Well, in 1812, we had war with Britain, and wars are really, really expensive. And when the War of 1812 was finished, we had a lot of debt. So there was talk again of another national bank, and one was created a few years later, the Second Bank of the United States, also in Philadelphia. And this had a lot more power than that first bank of the United States did. Well, one of the things the bank did was issue paper currency. Here you see one, and the state of Maryland put a tax on that because they didn't really want it in their state. This was sort of like the stamp tax during the Revolution. And Mr. McCulloch, who was a bank teller in Baltimore, refused to pay that tax that the state of Maryland put on those banknotes. So one thing led to another, and it finally ended up at the Supreme Court, which then, in 1819, met in the basement of the Capitol. And lo and behold, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was John Marshall, who had been the Chief Justice during Marbury versus Madison in 1803. And it was Marshall that took the power of judicial review for the court. Well, the state of Maryland argued that the 10th Amendment is quite clear. Powers not given to the central government are given to the states and to the people. So Congress, by creating a bank, exceeded what it can do in the Constitution, whereas the government argued that under Article 1, Section 8, which we call the Necessary and Proper Clause, the government can do whatever it needs to do to govern, and therefore a bank makes perfect sense for a new nation. And the government also argued that under Article 6, which talks about the Constitution being the supreme law of the land, the federal government is supreme over the state governments. Well, it turns out that when Andrew Jackson was president in the 1830s, he took away all the money that was in the Bank of the United States, so it would evaporate because he wasn't a fan, and that happened. But the legacy of McCulloch versus Maryland goes way beyond the fact that the Second Bank of the United States disappeared. What it did do is set the context for big government programs like the New Deal, which was Franklin Roosevelt's attempt to get us out of the Great Depression. A lot of the criticism of the New Deal was that it's not constitutional, but they said, hey, necessary and proper clause lets us do that. And things like Social Security, which again are not mentioned in the Constitution, but people argued it's necessary and proper that we have this given the nature of our society. So the necessary and proper clause became a big deal in the court case of McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. Still a big debate today, isn't it? The role of the states versus the role of the federal government. Ongoing drama in our country.